Hi, everyone. Welcome to CSR Talent Group's Corporate Impact Leaders podcast. Today, we're happy to have with us Melissa Smith, VP of Sustainability at Sun Communities. Melissa, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you spending the time with us and wanted to start with a quick question about your career in ESG and getting a sense of what you're currently doing at Sun Communities.
Yeah, so I appreciate being asked to join this, and I think I have a interesting career in ESG CSR realm. For me, it actually started when I was 15, and I had the opportunity to join a volunteer fire department in Maine, which during that experience I was exposed to for the first time in my life the concept of OSHA and EPA. And it was a paid volunteer fire department. So a number of the volunteers worked at the local manufacturing facility in the environment, health, and safety department. And that was my introduction to the concept that this career even existed. Um, I continued doing this stuff through college. It was like, this is great. I'm going to be a firefighter. I'm going to work for corporate.
Hmm.
So I did that through college, had a chance to actually intern at that manufacturing facility for that team. And then following college, uh, I got a job in the auto industry in Michigan, working on the safety team.
Hmm.
Did that for a number of years doing safety for research and design and manufacturing. Then was asked to take on environmental reporting, particularly around greenhouse gas and waste and water. We were in the early days of the 2000s, so the GHG protocol was new. We were all figuring out how to do it. Did that now for another 5 years. And then the company, during the economic downturn of 2008, we had some retirements. And that left open the company's department for corporate foundation, charitable giving, and volunteering. And I was asked to oversee that group for about 2 years, in addition to my environmental reporting duties. During that time, I trained up some other team members to do carbon accounting and that reporting. And then I spent 9 years doing just corporate foundation, corporate giving, to volunteerism for the company for the North American region. Um, During that period, I also touched in with the government affairs team, the communications team, kind of was touching into a lot of different roles. And after about 20 years with that particular employer, I wanted to, one, go back to carbon accounting. I realized how much I missed it. I know that's strange, but I love carbon accounting. And I also wanted to pull together that safety, environment, government affairs, charitable giving, communications skills that I had developed over those nearly 20 years. And there wasn't an opportunity to do that at the company I was with, but an opportunity arose with a company a mile up the street that needed an ESG head. And so that's how I landed from automotive manufacturing to real estate and where I am currently. So I am the vice president of sustainability for a publicly traded REIT. And my role here is, all the ESG disclosures, the environmental reporting, and overseeing some of the stuff that happens on the social side to make sure we're making those disclosures. Same with the governance pieces, making sure we're touching on the items within governance that we need to get out and be focused on. And I do that for the company's portfolio that is US, Canada, and UK, and is housing, campgrounds, marinas, and what in the UK are called caravan parks. So it's a very big portfolio, and it's a lot of different moving pieces, but a great opportunity to pull all that automotive experience into one place.
Oh, that's fantastic. And that's quite the story of how you got there. I'm sure that'll be inspirational to a lot of younger folks listening in. Um, just to sort of close the loop on that, it sounds like you've done so many different parts of ESG and got a good foundational training on the safety side and the EHS side. Is there anything under ESG that you're not currently overseeing right now, or anything in the ESG portfolio um, that you're still learning about or needing to sort of expand your responsibilities around?
The area that I'm probably most focused on learning is the governance side. My previous company was not publicly traded in the United States, so it didn't really encompass governance during that role. But over the last 3.5 years, I've really spent a lot of time making sure I understand governance, learning it. It's really fascinating understand that
Yeah,
in addition to taking in that experience that I had on the environment and social side.
yeah.
It's kind of nice to close the loop on the ESG
That
circle.
um, we didn't talk about this earlier, but let me ask you this. So you talked a lot about collaborating with government affairs, communications, different departments at the different companies you've worked at. Um, just curious, how many people are on your team? And more importantly, how big is the ESG sort of internal team, beyond your direct reports? How do you see the range of individuals involved in ESG at Sun Communities?
So my direct team is really small. I keep it at one person, and that's actually intentional on my perspective from that past experience. I want to be able to work across the company with all the different roles that touch into E, S, and G
Mhm.
focus areas. I want those team members to be the experts and, the owners of that role. And I see the ESG's role as the connector and making sure we've got the disclosures, making sure that we are looking at that bigger picture. Because sometimes when you're only focused on environment, you may not realize what the impact your role is doing to the social side.
Right.
And I really see ESG as sort of the person that's the bridge that sees that bigger picture, make sure the dots are connected,
Mhm.
and helps identify opportunities for that collaboration. And this way, it's also not something that, well, that's just the ESG team's job. It's now that role and responsibility is spread. And I have found that to be the most effective approach versus having a really big team that has that control of it.
Yeah. No, I think that will resonate with a lot of people listening that many of the companies we've worked with have small teams. I don't know if there's successful as it sounds like you are as far as connecting and bridging with other departments and other people in the company. But let me ask you this, some of the challenges that you faced. Would like to hear about the challenges and successes, but let's start with the challenges. What are the key issues that you face or the challenges you face? And also, um, are you given the resources and the staffing, frankly, that you need to get things done? And I know we're trying to make this podcast something that where people can take away insights or practical tips. So any thoughts about those challenges and how you've really addressed them would be really helpful.
I think the biggest challenge has been, whether it's in my current role or in my previous role, like corporate foundation grant making, was really getting people to understand the impact and the value, and that these aren't just nice to haves. Uh, it's really important to be able to connect what we're doing to the company's business case. Um, Sometimes that can be not what people want to hear. If you're in the charitable giving side, you know that everybody has a cause, they love their nonprofits. And when they come to the corporation and want the corporation to give them money, and you're like, I love the cause, but it doesn't fit with our priorities and our business case.
Mhm.
Um, like sometimes makes you the bad guy on the corporate foundation and giving side. But you have to keep that focus on what really resonates with the business and that underlying core. I've also always found the challenge has been language.
Yeah.
In my current portfolio, we're housing, people live with us. Um, when we're talking about reducing our carbon footprint, that's not necessarily the language that would resonate with somebody who is concerned about making sure they have enough money for all of their home resources and food and medication and transportation. But if I talk with them about things that we could do to help them lower their utility bills and
Mhm.
have more money, then, that resonates a little bit more. So one of the challenges has always been just understanding the language and who I'm communicating with and using the right tools and wording when I'm meeting with them to help understand what their needs are and how does it connect the dot to what we're trying to do. Um, that's, you learn that as you go along. Sometimes you say the wrong thing. You got to
Yeah.
pick up and go from there. And what's the right phrasing? Sometimes you think you have it all laid out correctly and then realize, nope, that did not work. So it's a lot of trial and error.
Yeah.
And that's really how I've been able to work towards the successes is paying attention to what I'm communicating and how I'm communicating it.
Yeah, that's so interesting because we hear a lot from people about value and impact, and it means so many different things to so many different people. So could you talk about that a little bit more? That was a great example you provided about the utility expense, and the value that you're providing to the homeowner or to the person using the house. What about the business leaders? What kind of impact messaging or value creation are you talking to them about? How do you what's the language you use for that?
So even there, we look at what is the economic impact that our initiatives may have on their portfolio. Um, you know, Ultimately, if I want to reduce, say, the carbon footprint of my electricity, I
Mhm.
need to do that through sustained reductions in electrical usage. But that also will mean a lower utility bill, and that's money that they can put back into other areas of the business. And so with them, it's the same thing. They're not necessarily going to talk in greenhouse gas emissions or any of the, ESG speak that I have,
Mhm.
but they will talk about what's our overlying operating expenses and how can we reduce it. And maybe there is an outlay of money here, but we've looked back and this is what it's been costing you over the years. And here's where we see that savings can be. And then I can still get the environmental impacts that I need to report, say, to an investor who does talk in GHG emissions
Mhm.
without ever having to share that, with leadership. I just talked about lowering their utility bill.
Yeah.
Those two things you can do in tandem and still get to that point. Um, it's the same as social. Like you might be talking with a team leader about, you know, retention of their team, engagement of their team, and performance. But, pointing out that, hey, if we can keep these team members and we keep them engaged, you don't have to go through that hiring window. You don't have to do that onboarding, and there's costs associated with that. And then that ultimately we have higher retention of our team. So those are types of ways that we look at it. And it's really taking that moment to think about what's going to matter to who I'm talking to and being able to switch language.
And so that's where the charitable giving and the foundation work comes in, as far as being able to communicate with employees or stakeholders about issues that are important to them that might improve retention or engagement.
That can be there. Even within the company, what are some of the business practices that we have that are either reasons why people stay with us or maybe reasons why people are leaving?
Yeah.
Really looking at a lot of data. I mean, you have engagement surveys, you have pulse surveys, you have a lot of direct and indirect feedback. What are people telling us? And then what works and what doesn't work?
Hmm.
Really taking the time to understand those impacts. We do the same thing down to, our customers. What do our residents and guests think about us as a business? What are they saying in the surveys, the online reviews, just their one-on-one communications with us? What's working, what's not working? Um, and then how do we build on the things that are working and then maybe work to address the things that aren't working in the way that people would like to see.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Related, obviously, we are in an interesting time, to put it mildly, when it comes to ESG and the pushback against ESG and related issues, DEI and wokeism. I'm curious how that has affected your work and your communication, the language that you use, and or whether it has at all. Any thoughts about and that evolution has been happening for a couple of years now, at least. So I'm curious how you've had to change your approach or your communications approach and strategy, given that there's a fair amount of pushback around ESG.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing you bring up. So I graduated from college in 2000, in December of 2000. So that was the Bush Gore election. And if for people who don't remember, one of the things that the Clinton administration had done had been to put in a bunch of safety and environmental policies that were going to, particularly around ergonomics, and it was the rules were in place. This was going to create a huge demand for EHS professionals. One of the first things Bush did when he came into office was he rescinded all those policies. So
Yeah.
suddenly, right when I graduated from college and my first experience with the working world, I had that experience of when your administration changes and their priorities shift, how does that impact what you're doing?
Mhm.
And so very early in my career, I built in that awareness to monitor what is the current climate and how does that impact both messaging and approach. ESG, CSR, whatever you want to call it, doesn't go away simply because it's being attacked. We just change the way we message it, the way we're talking, maybe how visible it is. We're just looking at, in this current environment, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. Maybe we're going to use a different word. I mean, I have seen this field's name change multiple times in the 25 years I've been in it. You just go with the flow. But at the end of the day, you know, what we've said is our message is going to be what are we doing to identify and minimize the impact on the environment from our business?
Mhm.
How are we making sure we treat people the way they deserve to be treated and they want to be treated?
Mhm.
And then how are we showing that we are ethical business with the right oversights to make sure that we are doing what we're supposed to do?
Mhm.
How I message that can vary based on who the audience is. It can year to year, what's the topic of the year? But those are the things that we're going to communicate, regardless of if I use the phrase DEI, ESG, sustainability. Um, that language is fluid and we'll just make those adjustments.
And do you have to, that makes total sense. And do you have to, do senior leaders ask for your help in thinking through how they talk about this, or are they pretty well versed on this and they're just consistent in how they message and communicate this?
In this realm, this year in particular, we've been having some ongoing conversations about how do we want to approach this. We are going to continue having those discussions over the next couple weeks and months as we prepare for the 2025 reporting cycle.
Mhm.
Um, Kind of just gauging what words maybe we're just not going to use because
Yeah.
it they've just been weaponized or they just bring the wrong energy to the conversation.
Yeah.
Um, but that doesn't mean we're not going to talk about it. We might just find a different way to present it. And so that's going to be an ongoing conversation as we kind of monitor. But that's something we do, all along the way. Like, what are investors asking? What is the general public? What have they latched onto? What are they sort of not cool with? And then how do we just adjust with that?
Right. So you're adapting constantly as you gather.
Yeah, because you don't want the message to get lost because you used the wrong word.
Right. Right.
Like at the end of the day, you want the message out there, and if you just have to adjust your wording so it gets to them, kind of like we said, like I don't use carbon accounting or GHG emissions with my residents. I talk about utility reductions.
Sure.
We're constantly doing that kind of adjustment. Yeah.
Switching gears for a second, I understand that scope three tracking and reporting is a major area of your work, and I think it's of great interest to a lot of people now, given different regulations in Europe and possibly United States. Can you tell us more about your approach and how you address reporting gaps and the issues that come up for a lot of companies around gathering data and being able to collect that information?
Yeah. So, I mean, I always clarify when we talk about this is I love carbon accounting. I love GHG reporting. I've been doing it since the early 2000s. As I said, it's one of the reasons I made a career switch is I wanted to get back into doing it more. Um, but what we've done, our portfolio is really big. We have 660 properties in 3 countries.
Hmm.
It's a very large portfolio of real estate. And so there are areas where there are data gaps. One for us in particular is with manufactured housing, we have an interesting ownership in that we own the land that the homes sit on, but the resident may own the home. And
Right.
typically, if the resident owns the home, they have their own relationship with the utility company.
Hmm.
So I don't have their utility bills for downstream lease reporting. Um, yes, there are processes where we could all sign paperwork and they could give permission for me to get their bills, but our portfolio is large. We're talking about 100,000 households.
Yeah.
Neither I or the utilities want to manage that many sign sheets on any given basis. So we use estimated data.
Yeah.
The EIA has data on housing by home types, so they do have a category for manufactured housing, and they have that data for owned versus rented.
Hmm.
So we use that. I know which homes are owned by my residents. I know which ones are rented. Um, we also really, with our scope three, really looked at each category and had a discussion on how would we approach our strategies with this to understand the level of data that we would need. So say for purchase goods and services, we choose to use a spend base. For us, it's more important to isolate what spend areas are our highest emissions so that we can develop a strategy for that overall spend area versus that specific product or service within that category. So I don't go to my suppliers and ask them for data. We look at the spend categories and we use EPA commodity codes. That's how we're going to approach it, which means that one, my data is a little bit quicker.
Yeah.
We do report all applicable scope three categories. So I have a very intensive inventory that, you know, for the most part, I've built out. We've also had to create methodologies that are specific to our business case. There are certain things that we do as a business that are not necessarily common. And so there's not a methodology. So we've created those methodologies. We get them validated by our consultants and people we partner with.
Mhm.
And we're very transparent on that data. There is estimations used. We're always transparent on what the estimations are used, why we're using estimations. And the biggest piece is when we use estimations, why are we using it? Is it because it's 100,000 households and it's just not reasonable for us to go get that data?
Yeah.
But we can make decisions based on that estimated information. That's really how we've approached it. The other thing we've done to help with leadership, in particular to understand scope three data, we use the ISO 14064 categories as well. And for those who aren't familiar with it, that is another greenhouse gas protocol out there. And it takes and breaks the categories into 5 categories. So you have your category 1, which is your stationary combustion, propane. It is actually where water lands, which we appreciate. Category 2 is your electrical. And category 3 is all your transportation items together. Category 4 is your goods and services and waste. And category 5 is all that downstream leased assets, investments, franchises, the things that you have more influence. We found with leadership and even externally, when we group it in those categories, it makes it a lot easier for people to think about the data that we need within those and how we're going to action it.
Hmm.
And that's really helped. So we report to both protocols, but we do a lot of our action and build around those categories and thinking about transportation together, goods and services together, and then that downstream stuff where we may not have operational or financial control, but we have influence. We can make some longer term guidance with them.
So just a quick question on this. So for your scope three goals, um, for the future, given that you're using estimations or you're collecting data, that are mostly estimates, are you working with any of your vendors to try to reduce, their emissions, or do you have goals that you report to, or that you communicate with your vendors about that you're asking them to help you achieve or help, and you're working with them to help them achieve? How does that work?
Yeah, our biggest one is around homes.
Yeah.
So manufactured housing in RV resorts has a lot of buildings.
Yeah.
And we work very closely with the vendors who build those homes to have one, the most energy efficient homes, that their manufacturing processes are efficient as possible, that the transport of those buildings is as efficient as we can potentially do. This is a big area that we're all looking into. And then,
Mhm.
what's that setup process?
Yeah.
So that's really we've got the biggest focus. And then we'll start dealing with, a next large category would be lawn services. Well, what are we going to do there? Those are conversations that we're having.
Yeah, interesting. Well, this is also interesting. I'm sure we could keep talking for another 3 hours, but I want to wrap this up with a question about, the things you've learned over the course of your career, which sounds fascinating. And thank you for giving us that background because I think that will be inspiring to a lot of people. Um, well, given that you've, executed a bunch of strategies and developed a bunch of approaches and impact goals and a few companies, what would you say are the top three things you've learned about getting things done and what it takes to be a successful corporate impact leader?
Well, that's a good challenge one. I think the first one for me, though, and is probably evident in my career pathway, is to be curious
Hmm.
and to be open to change. A lot of the adjustments that I've made in my career were not things that were necessarily driven by me, but were by leadership coming and saying, we want you to take this on. And they may not have been areas that I knew at the time, but I'm curious by nature. And so I happily jumped in to learn them. Um, they weren't always things as I said, they weren't always things I wanted to do in that moment of time, but they ultimately all ended up being really good learning experiences. So that has always been a big one. And I've noticed over the years that's also helped me with collaborating with departments is being curious about what everybody else is doing and trying to understand so that I can help maximize what they're doing.
Yeah.
Um, I think the other one is really just learning how to communicate better and speak the language of who you're speaking with. Even within a company, everybody's priorities are different. So really understanding what is their needs and how can I help them has been another piece to that success and collaboration. Um, and I think it's just having fun with it. I
Yeah.
mean,
No, that's great. No,
it's
and that all
it's
makes sense given what you said earlier about being a connector or helping to bridge. And the fact that you have one full-time staff person, you've really got to leverage a lot of different people in the company to help you get things done or to help the company get things done.
yeah, I can't be an expert on everything, but there are
Yeah.
experts within the company, so I'm gonna go find them, learn what I can from them, but they're still going to be the expert in their realm, and that's really been valuable is finding those experts.
Well, it sounds like you're an expert in your realm. So I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much for your
Yeah.
time. We may get questions from people and I'll forward them to you and let's do this again sometime because 25 minutes is not enough time to really understand everything you do, but I think this will be helpful for a lot of people. So thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Tom.